Unless you've been living under a particularly dense rock for the last couple of weeks, you're probably well aware that Russia most definitely did, or most definitely did not, intervene in the latest United States election. Most of the discussion revolves around the domestic aspect of the issue. What does this mean for the election? How does it affect Trump? Does this delegitimize his presidency? Can we somehow use this to keep him from moving into the White House? And while the internal discussion is pretty popcorn munching worthy, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about foreign policy because I haven't heard very many people say anything that's really cogent about it. The response to the issue has basically boiled down to two camps. On the one hand, you have this is awful, really bad, Russia shouldn't have done this, we need to retaliate against Russia, Putin's really bad, bad Putin. And then on the other hand, we have well, we won, so who cares, so stop whining. Now, I'm not trying to say that the second camp is necessarily right, but as for the first one, well, you probably saw the title of the video. Now, regardless of your political affiliation, if you listen to Ben Shapiro, you probably know that he's a very moral and upstanding man with a strong sense of integrity. But in this issue, and maybe because of that, he has a bit of a blind spot. See, here's the thing. While it's certainly scandalous among Americans that Russia hacked into the DNC's email and then leaked those contents to the internet, there's not much that the United States can do about it. For starters, if America goes to the international community clutching her pearls about Russian interventionism, most countries might respond with something along the lines of glass houses and throwing stones. I mean, if the United States goes to Germany, for example, asking for sanctions against Russia, it might be a good opportunity for the Chancellor to remind the United States about their spying on her. Even if the US unilaterally, or managed to convince some of its allies to go along with, applies sanctions to Russia, it's not going to have all that much impact on Putin himself. I mean, Putin is still going to live in a presidential palace. He's still going to be driven around in fancy new cars. His overall lifestyle is not going to be impacted by sanctions. I mean, let's not forget that the United States and Europe slapped sanctions on Russia after Russia annexed Crimea, and that didn't stop Russia from trying to get another piece of the Ukraine in Donbass or getting involved in Syria. So Secretary of State-to-be Rex Tillerson is kind of right when he says that sanctions are not effective, trying to turn that into saying that because he doesn't agree with sanctions, he's being friendly towards Russia. Well, maybe it's because he sees that sanctions don't work. Because the people who are most affected by sanctions are not the people who are in power. They have ways of getting around it. The average citizen doesn't have ways of getting around sanctions, and they're the most impacted. Now, of course, they're going to be very unhappy about it, about not having access to their creature comforts. But are they going to see this as the fault of their government, or are they going to see this as the fault, or are they going to blame the people who are putting the sanctions on them in the first place? Even if the sanctions did serve to annoy the people with their current government, that only works if the government is a democracy. Western countries have to be constantly worried about their approval ratings because they might get voted out in the next election. But this is not a concern for a dictatorship because they have absolute control over their populace. And this is why countries like, for example, Cuba, have lived for decades under sanctions and there hasn't been any regime change. Another example might be Venezuela, which isn't under any sanctions, but the people living there are in significantly worse conditions than anyone in Russia would be under US sanctions. I mean, if the people of Venezuela are not revolting against Nicolas Maduro despite having significant difficulties getting enough food and getting medicine, what makes you think that the Russians are going to revolt against Putin because the United States buys less vodka? I mean, that means there's more vodka for the Russians. Because, like it or not, Europe is not going to stop buying gas from Russia, and that is where the real money is. Petroleum exports account for the overwhelming majority of Russian exports and the significant portion of their economy. And you can't expect Europeans to freeze themselves in the middle of winter because the DNC didn't put enough security on their email server. In the end, this is why pushing this Russian intervention thing only helps Putin. Putin is going to be the biggest winner out of this. Why? Because there are only upsides for him. First, to Russia and her allies, and to a certain extent her enemies, it's going to look like Russia has a significant influence on US internal affairs. That makes Russia look more powerful. There are people, quite a lot of people surprisingly, who say that Trump is a puppet of Putin. Wrap your head around that a little bit. There are people who believe that the most powerful man in the world, or who will be in after January 20th, the President of the United States is a puppet to Putin. He's in Putin's pocket. What do you think that does to Putin's prestige, his bargaining ability, and his overall reputation around the world? It certainly doesn't make him look weak. This is the biggest propaganda coup Putin could have achieved, and it's being broadcasted by US media around the world and confirmed by members of the United States Congress and of the United States intelligence community. Essentially, it's saying that the United States electoral process is at least vulnerable to Russian intervention. Now, how do you think that is going to impact America's ability to promote and defend democracy and liberal values around the world when its own democratic process is not necessarily invulnerable to Russian intervention? The more credit that's given to Russian cyber activity, the stronger Russia looks and the weaker the US looks in comparison. This has a direct impact on America's diplomacy and ability to pursue her interests in the world stage. Strategically, from a foreign relations perspective, the best thing to do would be to downplay Russian influence, something that President Obama is already doing despite the interest of the Democrats. I mean, the really, really best thing to do would have been to make sure it didn't happen in the first place, but the cat's out of the bag already. But if you think Putin is the problem, then giving him more power is probably not the best idea. Now, there's a lot more to be said on the subject because foreign relations are really complicated. But it's important to remember that domestic policy doesn't necessarily connect with foreign policy, and what looks really good or works really well from an internal strategic political point of view might not necessarily work so well on the foreign stage. So anyway, comment if you want me to do more stuff on foreign relations, or if you think I'm an idiot. That also works for a comment, but I'd rather we have a sane discussion, so hopefully we can, or at least I can learn something new. And if you like the video, there's a button down there for that. If you haven't subscribed, please do, because it motivates me to make more videos. Take care.